In the unforgiving heart of the Texas Panhandle towns were forged from dust grit and a simmering hatred for anything that was different. In the town of Redemption's Bluff, fear was the local currency, and the law was whatever the sheriff decided it was that morning. But for a lone woman named Celine, compassion was a higher authority. What she discovered in the blood-soaked shadows of a saloon would not only test her courage, but would ignite a firestorm that threatened to burn her world to the ground. By the time the sun bled across the horizon, an entire nation of warriors would come for what was theirs. The swinging doors of the Redemption Saloon were a set of gnashing teeth, spitting out drunken cowboys and swallowing the desperate. For Selena Vance, the daughter of the town's only doctor, they were a gateway to a world she was meant to shun. But tonight, a frantic tap on her father's clinic door from Jed the saloon's timid bartender had dragged her into its grimy embrace. "He's in the back, Miss Vance." Jed stammered, his eyes wide with fear. Sheriff Brody said to leave him be, said he got what he deserved. But it ain't right. Nobody deserves that. Selena clutched her worn leather satchel, the familiar weight of bandages, salves and steel instruments, a small comfort against the reek of stale beer and sweat. The main room was a cacophony of slurred laughter and the clumsy clatter of poker chips. But as Jed led her past the bar and down a short, dark hallway, a profound silence took its place. The storeroom was small, cluttered with barrels and crates. Lying on a pile of discarded burlap sacks was a man. He was Comanche. That much was clear from the high cheekbones and the strong line of his jaw visible even through the blood and swelling. His long black hair was matted with sawdust and something darker. He was stripped to his breechcloth, his torso a canvas of brutal artistry, deep gashes, the unmistakable circular brand of a cattle iron, seared into his shoulder, and a constellation of bruises that painted his skin in shades of purple and black. He was half dead, but his eyes, when they flickered open, were fiercely alive. They were the color of dark, storm-tossed earth, and they fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. There was no plea for help, no fear, only a defiant, burning pride. "Who did this?" Selena asked, her voice a low whisper as she knelt beside him. Jed flinched, twisting his apron in his hands. Silas Croft's ranch hands, 4 of them. They said he was trespassing. The sheriff? He just watched. Silas Croft. The name hung in the air like poison. The wealthiest rancher in the county, a man who saw the treaty lands bordering his property, not as a border, but as a future acquisition. Sheriff Brody was little more than Croft's hired gun, wearing a tin star as a shield for his cruelty. Celine ignored the fear coiling in her own stomach. She was her father's daughter. Dr. Abram Vance had taught her that a man in need of healing was just that, a man. His creed was simple. We mend what is broken, Celine. We don't ask how it broke. She opened her satchel. Jed, I need clean water. And whiskey. Not for him to drink. As Jed scurried away, Selena gently began her work. Her fingers, trained and steady, probed a long, ugly cut along his ribs. It was deep, crudely stitched with what looked like twine. He flinched, a hiss of pain escaping his clenched teeth, but he didn't cry out. His control was absolute, almost unnerving. "I'm not going to hurt you further," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "My name is Celine Vance. I'm here to help." He said nothing, but the inferno in his eyes banked slightly, replaced by a flicker of guarded curiosity. He watched her every move as she cleaned the wounds, the whiskey stinging but sterilizing. He watched as she snipped the rough twine and began to suture the gash with neat, practiced stitches. Her touch was firm but gentle, professional, yet profoundly human. She worked in the dim lantern light, the sounds of the saloon a distant world away. Here in this small, quiet room, there was only the sharp scent of antiseptic, the soft whisper of thread through flesh, and the shared breath of two people from worlds that were supposed to be at war. She found the source of the worst bleeding, a puncture wound in his side, shallow enough to have missed any vital organs, but deep enough to have bled him near to death. It wasn't a knife wound. It was narrow, precise. It was the work of a branding iron spur. A final, deliberate act of humiliation. As she packed the wound with clean gauze, her fingers brushed against a small leather pouch tied to his breechcloth. It was still intact, somehow, missed by his attackers. Curiosity and a sense of professional necessity, in case it contained medicine or something significant, made her reach for it. His hand shot out impossibly fast and clamped around her wrist. His grip wasn't brutal, but it was like iron. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was a dry rasp, heavy with pain but clear. No, the single word was a command, a warning, and a plea all at once. Seleno froze her heart, hammering against her ribs. She wasn't afraid of him, she realized with a jolt. She was afraid for him. Whatever was in that pouch, he valued it more than his own life. She slowly relaxed her hand and pulled it away. "All right," she whispered. "All right." He released her wrist, his gaze never leaving her face. He had seen her intent, and he had seen her yield. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. She was not his enemy. By the time she finished, he was breathing more evenly. She had cleaned and stitched what she could, but he had a raging fever and needed more than she could provide in a dusty storeroom. Leaving him here was a death sentence. Sheriff Brody would eventually tire of the game and either finish the job himself or let Croft's men do it. "You can't stay here," she said more to herself than to him. Jed returned, his face pale. "Sheriff's asking about you, Miss Vance. Says your pa will be worried." It was a thinly veiled threat. Celine's mind raced. Her father's clinic was too public. Her own small cabin just on the edge of town was her only option. It was nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, offering some cover. But how could she move a man in his condition without being seen? The Comanche warrior seemed to read her thoughts. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his body trembling with the effort. His eyes were fixed on the storeroom's back window, a small square of glass that looked out onto the dark, refuse-strewn alley. The alley, he rasped. It was a risk, a terrible one, but it was the only one they had. Jed Selena said, her voice, now firm with decision. "Go tell the sheriff I've left. Tell him this man is barely breathing and won't last the night. Tell him whatever he wants to hear. Then meet me at the back of the alley in 5 minutes with a horse. Not a buggy. Just a horse." Jed's eyes widened, but he saw the resolve in her face. He simply nodded and disappeared. Selena turned back to the warrior. "Can you stand?" He gritted his teeth, and using a stack of crates for leverage, slowly, agonizingly pulled himself to his feet. He swayed his body, screaming in protest, but he stood. In the dim light, she could see the proud set of his shoulders, the unyielding strength that refused to be broken. He was a chief, or the son of one. She was sure of it, a man of immense importance. And she, Celine Vance, a doctor's daughter in a town that hated his people, had just made him her responsibility. As she helped him limp towards the back window, she knew she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The fate of this man, and likely her own, now rested on a desperate gamble in the dark. The night air was a cold shock after the stale confines of the saloon. Kevin, he had finally whispered his name as she helped him onto the horse Jed had brought, leaned heavily against her, his breath hot and ragged against her neck. Every jostle of the horse's gait sent a tremor of pain through his body, a silent agony she could feel, as if it were her own. The short ride to her cabin on the edge of Redemption's Bluff felt like a perilous journey across a hostile continent. Her cabin was a humble thing, built by her own hands with her father's help. It was a single room, with a stone hearth, a narrow bed, a table, and shelves filled with books and jars of herbs. To Selina, it was a sanctuary. Tonight, it had to be a fortress. Getting Kevin inside was a clumsy, painful affair. He collapsed onto her narrow bed, his fever-bright eyes scanning the small space, taking in every detail: the dried wildflowers in a jar, the worn copy of Leaves of Grass on her nightstand, the quiet order of her life. He was like a hawk brought into a dove's coat, all coiled power and watchful intensity even in his wounded state. "You are a medicine woman," he stated, his voice still a rasp. "Something like that," she replied, stoking the embers in the hearth. "My father is the town doctor. He taught me." She worked through the night, a silent, focused battle against the fever that threatened to consume him. She brewed a tea from willow bark to fight the inflammation, and bathed his face and chest with cool water. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words in his own tongue, the sounds foreign, but the meaning universal: pain, memory loss. In one of his lucid moments, as she was changing the dressing on his side, his eyes locked on hers. Why, he asked the single word, costing him a visible effort. Selena paused, the question hanging in the quiet room. Why risk everything for a stranger, an enemy in the eyes of everyone she knew? She thought of her father's creed, but it was more than that. It was the defiant pride in his eyes back in the saloon. It was the cold, arrogant cruelty on the faces of men like Sheriff Brody and Silas Croft. Because what they did was wrong, she said simply. And leaving you there would have been wrong too. His gaze held hers for a long moment, searching. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. He closed his eyes and finally succumbed to a true healing sleep. For the next 2 days, Selena lived a double life. By day, she assisted her father at the clinic, her face a mask of calm neutrality. She listened to the town's gossip, her stomach twisting into knots. The Comanche buck, they called him, was dead. Croft's men were boasting in the saloon, accepting free rounds of whiskey for their civic duty. Sheriff Brody swaggered through the streets, basking in the town's approval. No one suspected a thing. Every casual question from the sheriff, every lingering glance, felt like an accusation. By night, she slipped back to her cabin, a ghost flitting through the cottonwoods. She brought broth, clean bandages, and news of the outside world, which she delivered in hushed tones. Kevin's fever broke on the second night. The change was remarkable. The delirium receded, and the sharp intelligence returned to his eyes. He began to talk his English, careful and better than she'd expected. He told her he was of the Noconi band of Comanche. He was not just a warrior, but the son of the war chief Tarn. He had come to Redemption's Bluff not to fight, but to talk. There is a treaty, Kevin explained, his voice gaining strength. A line on a map. Silas Croft doesn't honor it. His cattle graze on our winter hunting grounds. His men muddy our streams. "So you came to speak with him?" Selene asked, incredulous. "I came to speak with the man with the star," Kevin corrected. "Sheriff Brody. To ask him to honor his own laws. It was a mistake. He is not a man of law. He is a man of greed." He told her of the ambush. Brody had met him under a flag of truce, then led him straight to Croft's men. It wasn't a fight. It was a planned execution. They hadn't just wanted to kill him. They had wanted to humiliate him to send a message. The brand on his shoulder wasn't for cattle. It was Croft's own insignia, a stylized SC, a mark of ownership. The more he spoke, the more the pieces clicked into place for Saloon. This wasn't just about racial hatred. It was about land. Croft wanted the Comanche lands, and Brody was helping him get them. Killing the chief's son under a false truce was an act of war. They wanted the Noconi to retaliate. A Comanche attack would bring the cavalry, and the cavalry would solve Croft's Indian problem for good. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't just hiding a wounded man. She was sitting on a conspiracy that could plunge the entire territory into a bloody war. On the third day, Kevin was strong enough to sit up on his own. He watched her as she moved about the cabin, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. "You live alone," he observed, away from the others. "I prefer the quiet," she said. It was only half the truth. The other half was that the town, with its petty cruelties and narrow minds, had never felt like home. "Your hands know the old ways," he said, nodding toward the herbs. "Our healers use many of the same plants." A connection was forming between them, fragile but real. It was woven in the quiet moments, the way he watched her, the way she anticipated his needs, the shared understanding of living on the fringes. She found herself noticing the way the firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, the quiet dignity in his posture, the deep timbre of his voice. She was drawn not just to the man she had saved, but to the man he was. That evening, as she was applying a fresh salve to the brand on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the ugly raised scar, he spoke again, his voice low. "My people are looking for me. They will not be quiet in their search." "How long do we have?" she asked, the fear a cold knot in her stomach. "Not long. When the sun rises for the 4th time since my capture, my father will come. He will not ask questions with his words." The 4th dawn. That was tomorrow. A sudden, desperate urgency seized her. She had to get him out. He had to be well away from Redemption's bluff before Tarn and his warriors arrived. A war would destroy everything her father, the town, the fragile peace she had carved for herself. "You need to leave tonight," she said, her voice tight. "As soon as it's dark. I can get you a horse. You can be miles away by morning." Kevin looked at her, his expression unreadable. He reached up and gently touched the side of her face, his calloused thumb tracing her jawline. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through her entire body. "And you, Saloon Vance?" he asked softly. "What will happen to you when they discover what you have done?" She had no answer, because in that moment she realized she was no longer just afraid of what the town would do to her. She was afraid of him leaving. She was afraid of the silence that would fill her cabin when he was gone. The secret she held in the cottonwoods had become more than a man she was healing. He had become a part of her sanctuary. And tomorrow the world was coming to tear it all down. The rising sun of the 4th day felt less like a promise and more like a threat. Kevin had refused to leave the night before. His reasoning was stark and logical. In his weakened state, he would be easy prey for any of Brody's patrols, and if he were caught, it would doom her completely. His presence in her cabin was a danger, but his capture outside of it was a certainty of death for them both. "We face the morning together," he had said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Selena's nerves were stretched taut as a bowstring. She moved through her morning chores at the clinic in a haze of suppressed panic. Every slam of a door, every raised voice on the street sent a jolt of fear through her. Sheriff Brody arrived just before noon. He didn't stride in with his usual bluster. He ambled a predator, feigning nonchalance. He leaned against the doorframe, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, his gaze sweeping the clinic before landing on her. "Mornin', Selena," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Dockin'," He's making a house call to the Miller place. Mrs. Miller is expecting, Selina replied, keeping her hands busy, organizing bottles on a shelf. Her back was to him, but she could feel his eyes on her. Heard you were down at the saloon the other night, Brody said, casually. Jed said you took a look at that Comanche trespasser. Jed was worried Selene said her voice even. The man was beaten. I did what I could, which wasn't much. I imagine he crawled off into the scrub to die. She hated the lie the way it felt like acid on her tongue. Brody pushed himself off the doorframe and took a slow step into the room. He picked up a glass vial, holding it up to the light. Funny thing that. We found a trail. Some blood, a few snapped twigs, led out toward the cottonwoods, right in the direction of your cabin. Selene's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She turned to face him, forcing a look of mild curiosity onto her face. Really coyotes, I suppose. They get bold this time of year. Could be Brody mused, setting the vial down. His eyes, small and cold, narrowed. Or it could be that a bleeding man found himself some help. Help from someone with a soft spot for strays. The accusation was unmistakable. He was fishing, laying a trap. He didn't have proof, but his instincts were sharp. He knew her father's compassionate nature, knew she existed just outside the town's cruel consensus. I don't know what you're implying, Sheriff, she said, her voice colder than she intended. I'm implying that harboring a hostile is a crime, Celine. A serious one. Silas Croft is offering a handsome reward for any information on that Comanche's whereabouts. Or his corpse. He's not particular. Brody smiled, a thin, predatory slash in his beard. Just thought you should know. A smart woman would want to be on the right side of things. He tipped his hat and left the threat lingering in the air long after he was gone. She fled back to the cabin as soon as her father returned. The moment she burst through the door, Kevin knew. He was on his feet, his movement still stiff, but imbued with a new urgency. He knows, she said, breathless. He doesn't have proof, but he suspects. He's watching me. Kevin moved to the cabin's single window, peering through a crack in the shutters. He is not watching. He is waiting. Fear gave way to a cold dread. Brody wasn't going to risk a public confrontation. He would wait for nightfall. He would come to her cabin, not with a warrant, but with his deputies, and perhaps Croft's men. There would be no arrest, no trial, just a quiet, brutal resolution in the dark. We have to run, Selena whispered the words, tasting of despair. Now. No, Kevin said, his voice firm. He turned from the window, his face grim. To run is to confirm his suspicion. He would hunt us down. And my people, they are coming. To run is to meet them on the trail with Brody's pack at our heels. The battle would happen in the open, and you would be caught in the middle. He walked to the hearth and picked up the iron poker, testing its weight. They will come here tonight. This is where we will stand. The thought was insane. Her small wooden cabin against a dozen armed men. It was a tomb. We can't fight them, Kevin. They'll burn the cabin to the ground with us in it. They will not have the chance, he said, his eyes glinting with a fierce, strategic light she hadn't seen before. They expect to find a wounded man and a frightened woman. They will not be expecting a warrior. He began to survey the cabin, not as a home, but as a fortification. He pointed to the heavy oak table. Here, against the door. He gestured to her father's old hunting rifle, mounted above the mantelpiece. Do you know how to use it? My father taught me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Good. The afternoon passed in a blur of tense preparation. They barricaded the door with the table and reinforced the shutters. As Kevin checked the rifle's action, Selene gathered her sharpest surgical tools, scalpels and knives, that could serve as wicked weapons in close quarters. The cozy sanctuary had transformed into a desperate hold-fast. As they worked, a new intimacy bloomed in the face of shared danger. The barriers between them dissolved. He was no longer just a patient. She was no longer just a healer. They were partners in a deadly gambit. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows through the cottonwoods, Kevin paused. He looked at her, his face etched with a pain that had nothing to do with his healing wounds. "Selena," he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "This was not my intent, to bring this darkness to your home." "You didn't bring it." She countered, her voice fierce. "It was already here. It was in the saloon in the sheriff's eyes. It's been here all along. I just chose not to see it." He reached out his hand, hovering for a moment before he gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had surrounded them all day. "You have the heart of a warrior, Selene Vance," he said softly. The sun finally set, plunging the world into darkness. The only light in the cabin was the low glow of the fire. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the trees sounded like the footfalls of approaching men. The silence stretched thin and fragile until it was shattered by the distant sharp bark of a dog in town. Then a new sound, a soft, rhythmic thudding. Kevin was instantly alert, his head cocked. It wasn't the sound of men on foot. It was horses. Many of them. But they weren't approaching recklessly. They were moving with a measured, deliberate slowness. He went to the window, peering through the crack. His body went rigid. "What is it?" Selene whispered, moving to his side. He didn't answer immediately. He just stared out into the darkness, his breath held. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, awe-struck whisper. "My father." He stepped back, gesturing for her to look. She pressed her eye to the crack in the shutter. At first, she saw nothing but the moon-dappled grove. Then she saw movement on the ridge that overlooked the town. A single rider silhouetted against the star-dusted sky. Then another. And another. Dozens of them appearing like spirits from the earth itself, their forms silent and imposing. They carried lances and rifles, their outlines sharp and deadly in the moonlight. They were not preparing for an attack. They were simply arriving, taking their positions, a silent, inescapable ring of warriors forming a cordon around the entire town of Redemption's Bluff. Brody wasn't coming for them. He couldn't. The hunter had just become the caged. The sight of the warriors on the ridge sent a wave of terror and awe through Selene. The silent, disciplined arrival was more intimidating than any wild charge could ever be. This was not a raid. It was a judgment. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The frantic, cornered fear of moments before was replaced by a tense, electric anticipation. Kevin stood by the window, his posture radiating a quiet power she now recognized as authority. He was no longer a fugitive in her home. He was a prince, awaiting the arrival of his king. "They will wait for the sun," Kevin said, his gaze fixed on the silhouetted figures. "My father is a patient man. He will let the town see what it faces. He will let their fear grow in the dark." The hours crawled by. Sleep was impossible. They sat in the firelight, the world outside their cabin, holding its breath. In this strange, suspended moment between the town's siege and the tribes, the last of their defenses crumbled. "That pouch," Selene said, breaking the long silence. "The one you wouldn't let me touch. What is in it?" Kevin looked at her, then reached down to the small leather bag still tied to his breechcloth. He hesitated for a moment before untying it. He didn't open it, but held it out to her on his open palm. It was worn smooth, with use the leather soft and dark. A treaty, he said. Not the one written on paper by your government's men. An older one. A promise bound with the hair of my grandfather and the man who was sheriff here 20 years ago, a man named Elias Thorne. It promised safe passage, mutual respect. It bound our peoples to peace as long as the river flowed. Sheriff Thorne Selina breathed the name a distant memory from her childhood. He was killed. They said it was a Comanche raid. Kevin's face hardened. He was murdered by men who wanted the peace to end. Men who saw this land only for the gold in its soil, not the life upon it. My father believes Silas Croft was one of those men. He closed his hand around the pouch. I brought this to show Sheriff Brody. I thought if he saw it, if he understood the history, I thought he might be a man of honor like Thorne. I was wrong. He saw it, and he laughed. He said history is written by the winners. The revelation was staggering. The entire foundation of the town's hatred, the story of the martyred Sheriff Thorne that fueled their prejudice, was a lie. A lie crafted by Silas Croft to seize land and power. Brody wasn't just a pawn. He was a knowing participant in a decades-long conspiracy. He and Croft. They didn't just want you dead, Selene pieced together her voice, a horrified whisper. They wanted your father to attack the town. They wanted a war. Yes, Kevin confirmed, his eyes dark with the grim truth. They burn our hunting grounds so we starve. They ambush our diplomats so we fight. And when we fight, the cavalry comes. Croft gets his land clean and empty. It was a monstrous, brilliant plan. And she and Kevin, by surviving, had ruined it. Their simple act of defiance had turned Croft's carefully orchestrated war into a tense standoff where the instigators were trapped inside their own town. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of grey and rose, Kevin turned to her. The gravity of the coming confrontation was etched on his face. Selene, when the sun rises, my father will ask for me. I will go out to him. But I will not do it alone. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm. They will call you a traitor. They will want you to pay for what you have done. Let them, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. She looked down at their joined hands. I'm not the person I was 4 days ago. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of profound respect that made her heart ache. I know. The first rays of sunlight struck the ridge, and the spectacle was breathtaking. The warriors were no longer silhouettes. Selene could see the details of their buckskin clothing, the intricate beadwork, the eagle feathers in their hair. At their center was a man who sat on his war pony with an unshakable stillness. He was older than Kevin, his face a mask of granite, his long hair streaked with silver. Even from this distance, his presence was immense. This was Tarn. A single powerful voice cut through the morning air, a call in the Comanche language. Kevin answered his own voice, strong and clear, a message sent across the divide. He turned back to Selene. It is time. Together they moved the table from the door. Kevin took the old rifle from her, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. He was not surrendering, nor was he attacking. He was stepping into the space between two worlds. He opened the door, and the bright morning light flooded the small, dark cabin. He took a breath and stepped outside. Selene, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, followed him. The entire town of Redemption's Bluff seemed to be watching. Faces peered from windows, men stood frozen on porches, their morning routines forgotten. In the center of the main street, Sheriff Brody and Silas Croft stood with a handful of their men, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and fury. They were surrounded, their authority rendered meaningless. Kevin walked slowly, deliberately, into the open space between the cabin and the town. He stopped and stood tall, his battered body a testament to his ordeal, his spirit unbroken. Selene stood a few paces behind him, a silent declaration of her allegiance. From the ridge, Tarn raised a hand. It was not a signal to attack. It was a call for a parley. He and a small party of warriors began to ride down the long slope toward the town, their movements unhurried, their confidence absolute. The reckoning had begun. The ground seemed to tremble under the steady rhythmic beat of the approaching hooves. Tarn and his 5 honor guards rode not with the speed of an attack, but with the deliberate, inexorable pace of fate. They stopped 50 yards from Kevin, their horses stamping and blowing clouds of steam into the crisp morning air. The silence that fell over Redemption's bluff was absolute, thick with a tension that was almost physical. Sheriff Brody and Silas Croft watched from the center of town, their faces masks of rage and disbelief. Their trap had not only failed, it had sprung shut on them. Tane's eyes, so like his son's, swept over the scene. They rested on Kevin, taking in the still raw wounds, the brand on his shoulder, the exhaustion etched on his face. A flicker of profound grief and cold anger passed through them before they settled on Selene. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "My son Tarn," said his voice, deep and resonant, carrying easily across the open space. His English was as clear as Kevin's. "You stand with a white woman." "She stood with me when I was left for dead," Kevin replied, his voice ringing with conviction. "She gave me shelter when her people would have given me a grave. Her name is Selene Vance, and she has the heart of a chief." The declaration stunned the townsfolk who could hear it. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, Brody's face purpled with rage. Tarn considered this, his gaze still on Selene. She met it without flinching, her fear, a cold stone in her stomach, but her resolve a fire that burned it away. She would not look away. She would not show weakness. Finally, Tarn nodded slowly. "Then we owe her a debt." He shifted his gaze, pinning Sheriff Brody with a look of pure steel. "A debt is owed, and a crime must be answered. You man with the star, you broke a truce. You and the cattleman tried to murder my son." "That's a lie." Brody bellowed, his voice tight with panic. He was trespassing. He resisted arrest. "My men and I were just defending our property." Silas Croft stepped forward, his demeanor smooth and oily. "This is a misunderstanding, Chief. My men were perhaps overzealous. There is no need for this display. We can offer payment. Cattle, gold, name your price." Tarn let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Payment? You think gold can pay for this treachery? You think cattle can replace the honor of my son? You are fools." He turned to Kevin. "Tell them what you told me, my son. Tell them all." This was the moment. Kevin took a step forward, his voice rising clear and strong for all to hear. He told the story of the ambush of Brody's false promise of a parley. He held up the small leather pouch. "This is the treaty of peace made with Sheriff Elias Thorne," Kevin declared. "Sheriff Brody laughed at it before his men attacked me. He and Silas Croft planned my murder to provoke a war that would allow them to steal our land after the cavalry had cleared it for them." He pointed a finger directly at Croft. "He wants your homes, too. Once he has our land, he will own this entire valley. He will own Redemption's bluff. He will own all of you." The accusation hung in the air, a stunning counter-narrative to the one they had been fed for years. Some of the townsfolk began to look at each other, their expressions shifting from fear to confusion. and then to suspicion. They knew Croft's greed. They knew Brodie's cruelty. Kevin's story, as unbelievable as it sounded, had the bitter ring of truth. Dr. Abram Vance stepped out from the door of his clinic, his face pale but determined. He had heard everything. "Sheriff," he called out, his voice shaking but firm. "Is this true? Did you attack a man under a flag of truce?" "Shut up, old man." Brodie snarled, his composure cracking. "You'll believe this savage over your own law, man. I believe my daughter." Dr. Vance shot back, "And she is standing with him." The town was fracturing. The unified front of fear was breaking apart into individual pockets of doubt and conscience. This was exactly what Kevin had intended. He was not just fighting for his own justice, he was giving the town a chance to find its own. Croft saw the tide turning. He leaned in and whispered urgently to Brodie. The sheriff's hand drifted down, resting on the butt of his Colt. "This is our town," Brodie roared, trying to rally the men behind him. "Are we going to let a pack of savages dictate our laws?" But his words lacked the power they once held. The sight of the 100+ warriors ringing the town was a stark reminder of who truly held the power that morning. Tane raised his hand, silencing the rising tension. "We do not want your town. We do not want a war. We want the 2 men who tried to start one. Give them to us. Justice will be served, and we will leave in peace." The ultimatum was clear. Brodie and Croft in exchange for the town's survival. Croft's face went pale. He looked at the faces of the townsmen around him, men he had employed, intimidated, and bought for years. He saw no loyalty there. He saw only fear and a dawning, resentful clarity. Brodie, ever the cornered animal, made his choice. With a wild yell, he drew his pistol, but he didn't aim at Tane or Kevin. He aimed at the one person he blamed for ruining his plan. He aimed at Saloon. The world slowed to a crawl. The glint of the sun on Brodie's pistol, the feral snarl on his face, the collective gasp of the town, it all registered in a sickening, suspended moment. Selene stood frozen, the dark bore of the barrel, a final, terrifying judgment. But Kevin moved with a speed that defied his injuries. He threw himself in front of her, a human shield, his body absorbing the impact, just as the gun exploded with a deafening crack. The force of the bullet spun him around, a cry of pain torn from his lips as he crumpled to the ground. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then chaos erupted. From the ridge, a furious, guttural roar went up from the assembled warriors. It was the sound of a hornet's nest being torn open, a wave of pure rage that washed over the town. Lances were lowered, rifles were raised. The tenuous peace was shattered. Selene screamed Kevin's name, dropping to her knees beside him. Blood was already soaking through the front of his buckskin shirt, a dark crimson flower blooming over his chest. His eyes were wide with shock, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Tane's face was a mask of terrible fury. He let out a sharp command in his own tongue, and his 5 guards urged their horses forward, their weapons ready. Brodie, realizing his fatal error, fumbled to recock his pistol, his eyes wild with panic. He had not silenced a witness. He had just signed his own death warrant, and possibly that of the entire town. Silas Croft, his face ashen, took a step back, trying to melt into the small crowd of his own ranch hands, disassociating himself from the sheriff's madness. But something unexpected happened. Before Tane's warriors could charge, a second shot rang out. This one came not from the Comanche lines, but from the town itself. Sheriff Brodie staggered, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at his own chest, where a small, dark hole had appeared. His pistol clattered to the dusty street. He took one more stumbling step, his eyes meeting Selene's with a look of vacant confusion, before he collapsed face down in the dirt. All eyes turned toward the source of the shot. Standing on the porch of the general store was Jed, the timid bartender. He held a smoking shotgun, his knuckles white, his face pale, but set with a grim resolve he had never shown before. He shot an unarmed woman. Jed stammered, his voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear. That ain't the law. That ain't right. Jed's act of defiance broke the spell. It was as if a dam of complicity and fear had burst. Another man, the town blacksmith, stepped forward, his hammer held like a weapon. Jed's right. Brody and Croft. They've been poisoning this town for years. They tried to get us all killed for a land grab. Another voice shouted. The townsfolk who moments before had been a fearful mob were now turning on their own. Croft's ranch hands, seeing their employer abandoned and their sheriff dead, hesitated. Their loyalty was to a paycheck, not to a losing fight. They began to back away, lowering their weapons. On the slope, Tarn held up his hand, halting his warrior's advance. He watched the scene unfolding with a keen, intelligent gaze. He saw the sudden and violent realignment of justice within the town itself. Saloon, meanwhile, heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the man bleeding in her arms. She tore open his shirt, her medical training taking over her hands, moving with desperate precision. The bullet had entered high on his chest near the shoulder he'd already injured. It was bad, but if it had missed his lung, he might have a chance. Pressure, she muttered to herself, pressing a piece of torn cloth from her dress against the wound. "Father, I need my satchel." Dr. Vance was already running toward her, his black bag in hand. He knelt on the other side of Kevin, his professional calm overlaying a father's terror for his daughter. Let me see. As the Vances worked frantically to save Kevin's life in the middle of the street, the town's own reckoning came to a head. Silas Croft, seeing his power evaporate, made a desperate break for it. He darted between two buildings heading for the stables, but he didn't get far. Two of Tane's warriors, who had dismounted and moved with serpentine speed, intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. They disarmed him and dragged him, sputtering and cursing, back into the center of the street, dropping him at the feet of their chief. The balance of power had completely and irrevocably shifted. The law in Redemption's Bluff was no longer the man with the tin star, nor the man with the most gold. It was now a Comanche war chief, his grievously wounded son, and a town that had finally been forced to look at its own corrupted heart. Tarn dismounted, his movements fluid and majestic. He walked past the body of Sheriff Brody without a glance. He stopped before Silas Croft, his shadow falling over the terrified rancher. He did not look at Croft. Instead, he looked at the townsfolk who were now gathered in a silent, watching semicircle. "This man is the source of the poison," Tarn said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of cold steel. "His lies killed your Sheriff Thorne. His greed almost destroyed you today. He does not belong to my world, and he has proven he does not deserve to belong to yours." He looked at the blacksmith, then at Jed. "What is your justice for a man like this?" The question was a test, a final one. He was not claiming the right to punish Croft himself. He was giving the town the chance to prove it was worth sparing. The blacksmith looked at Jed, then at the other townsmen. A slow, grim consensus began to form on their faces. They had lived under Croft's thumb for too long. They had been his puppets, his pawns, and he had almost made them casualties. The blacksmith hefted his hammer. He'll stand trial. A real one. For the murder of Elias Thorne and for what he did here today. And if the circuit judge don't hang him, he added his voice, dropping low, "We will." Tarn held their gaze for a long moment, then gave a single satisfied nod. He turned his attention back to the most important matter. He walked over to where his son lay, his heart in his eyes, as he watched Selene and her father work. "Will he live?" he asked the question, stripped of all rank, leaving only the raw voice of a terrified father. Selene looked up, her hands covered in Kevin's blood. "The bullet is lodged against his collarbone. It missed the lung. But I have to get it out, and the fever will be a fight." She met the chief's gaze, her own fear and exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "But yes, if he is strong, he will live. He is my son." Tarn said a world of meaning in the simple words. "He is strong." The days that followed were a strange dream. The Comanche did not leave. They remained on the ridges, a silent, watchful presence, their campfires dotting the hillsides like a new constellation. They were not an occupying force, but guardians waiting for the scales of justice and life to find their balance. Kevin was moved to Dr. Vance's clinic. The small operating room became the heart of the town's fragile truce. Selene and her father worked side by side, a fusion of settler medicine and whispered advice from the Nokoni's own healer, a wise old woman named Pale Moon, who Tarn had sent down from the hills. They extracted the bullet in a long, tense operation, with Tarn himself standing vigil just outside the door. His stoicism a thin veil over a father's anxiety. Kevin fought. He battled the fever, the pain, the ghosts of the ordeal. And through it all, Selene was there. She was his anchor, her presence, a constant, soothing balm. In the quiet hours of the night when the fever dreams came, he would reach for her hand, and she would hold it, her touch pulling him back from the brink. The bond forged in the secrecy of her cabin was now tempered in the crucible of his recovery, becoming something unbreakable. The town of Redemption's Bluff was reborn in the fire of that morning. With Brody dead and Croft imprisoned in his own jail, awaiting the circuit judge, the town's dark heart had been cut out. The people forced to confront the lies they had lived by began to talk. Old stories were re-examined, and a new history was written, one not of savage raids, but of a peace betrayed by greed. Jed the bartender, the unlikely hero, was made acting sheriff, his quiet integrity, a welcome change from Brody's bluster. On the 10th day, Kevin was strong enough to walk, leaning on Selene's arm into the sunlight outside the clinic. His father was there to meet him. The reunion was one of few words, but the look that passed between them was one of immense pride, relief, and love. Tarn then turned to Selene. "You have saved my son twice, Selene Vance. My people, my family. We are in your debt. There is no gift that can repay such a thing, but we will try. Ask for anything, and it is yours." Selene looked at Kevin, whose eyes were already on her, filled with a question he didn't dare speak. She looked at her father, who stood on the clinic porch, his face a mixture of pride and sadness, already knowing what her answer would be. And she looked at the town, her town, a place she no longer felt a part of. She had crossed a bridge, and she had no desire to go back. "I ask for nothing," she said, her voice clear and steady. She looked back at Tarn, but her words were for his son. "A debt is a chain. I want no chains. I want only a choice." Kevin's heart soared. He understood. He stepped forward, taking her hand. He turned to his father. "Father, I wish to take a wife." Tarn looked from his son to Selene, and a slow, rare smile touched his lips. He had seen this coming in, the way they looked at each other, in the way his son's spirit had fought to return to her. A chief's son must have a strong wife. "One with the heart of a warrior," he said, echoing Kevin's own words. "You have chosen well." Her father Abram walked down the steps. He embraced his daughter, holding her tight. "I knew this was your path the moment you first set a broken bone better than I could," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Be happy, Saloon. That's all a father can ask. 2 days later, the Comanche prepared to leave. A beautiful paint mare, adorned with intricate beadwork, was brought for Selene. As she prepared to mount, Kevin came to her side. His wounds were healing, leaving scars that would forever tell the story of the last few weeks. He gently touched the side of her face. Are you sure? He asked softly. Their world is not yours. It will be a hard life. Selene placed her hand over his. This was never my world, she said, looking at the town. My world is with you, Kevin. Hard is not the same as wrong. We will make our own life in the space between. As they rode out of Redemption's Bluff, side by side, leading the long procession of warriors, the townsfolk came out to watch. There was no hatred in their eyes, no fear. There was respect. They were watching a legend being born, the story of the white medicine woman who had saved the chief's son, and in doing so had saved them all from themselves. Selena didn't look back. Her gaze was fixed forward on the vast open plains stretching before them, and on the man by her side. The future was an unwritten map, but for the first time in her life, she felt she was finally heading home. The scars of the past would remain on Kevin's body and in the town's memory, but the ones they would choose to make, together scars of a life lived with courage, honor, and a love that defied all borders, were the only ones that mattered now. The story of Selene and Kevin is a powerful reminder that the greatest frontiers are not on any map. They are the spaces between our hearts. It shows that in a world divided by fear and prejudice, a single act of courage, a single choice to heal instead of hate, can change the fate of nations. Their journey was not an end, but a beginning, the start of a new legacy, written not in blood, but in a love that was brave enough to build a bridge. If their incredible story of defiance, sacrifice, and devotion moved you, please help us share it with the world. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a timeless tale of the American West, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories of the forgotten heroes and unsung loves that shaped history. Thank you for listening.